Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just turn the lights off. That should do it. So thank you all for coming. As Kelly mentioned, this talk is a third-year evaluation lecture, and it's structured as a sort of overview of my scholarship. And as Kelly also mentioned, I'm a landscape theorist and historian, as well as a designer who focuses on the spatial politics and embodied dimensions of landscape architecture. So the title of my talk, The Performative Landscape Frameworks for Civic and Embodied Action, refers to the fact that my research addresses those two scales, the social or the civic, and the sentient or embodied. And by the performative landscape, I'm referring to both how landscape can catalyze engagement in the public realm through participatory techniques and through provocative socio-spatial interventions, as well as how it can stimulate bodily presence and action in space. In terms of structure, my research will be presented via 3 exploratory media: written scholarship, design research, and teaching as scholarship. And these media will be presented as they relate to my current studies on civic and embodied action. And I just want to sort of emphasize this idea of teaching as scholarship, because it's integral to my design research, and it allows me to apply theories I write about in action and exploration. So as a foundation for moving forward, I'm going to begin briefly by presenting the research and book emerging from my doctoral work on landscape architect Lawrence Halprin, the 1960s artistic avant-gardes and the rise of civil society, and the histories of urban renewal and social displacement, which I'll be examining through the framework Cultural Landscape Studies. So that early research has opened up 3 primary areas of investigation that continue to drive my work, which you see here in the lower slide. So that's landscape architecture or urban and public space design within contested territories or areas of socio-spatial conflict, activist design methods, both participatory and ethnographic, and the intersections of landscape, dance, choreography, and performance studies. So the research I refer to as the sort of foundation for these continuing areas of investigation is best represented, sorry, I need a little more light here, best represented by its culminating output, the book City Choreographer that Kelly mentioned, Lawrence Halprin in Urban Renewal America, which came out through University of Minnesota Press in 2014. So despite this work being partially conducted prior to me coming to USC, it's the topic of numerous lectures and panels and workshops I've been invited to participate in since the book's publication in my first years here. The context of the book is the contested American city at the height of urban crisis and renewal. And in it, I argue that Lawrence Halprin's most consequential legacy is not necessarily the built projects he left behind, but the creative process that he developed and deployed in collaboration with his wife, the dancer and choreographer Anna Halprin. So that process, which he and Anna called the RSVP cycles, was derived in the 1960s from experiments in choreographic scoring, and it represents an overlooked antecedent to today's approach to landscape and urban design, which emphasizes infrastructural networks, ecological processes, multidisciplinary collaboration, as well as public participation. And the book not only situates the process as an important precursor, but also demonstrates how those overlooked aspects of Halprin's choreographic method have the potential to shape and enrich contemporary approaches to structuring the city. In terms of contextualization, during the 1960s, a progressive liberation of the spectator from observer to active participant occurred in the visual and performing arts, which were reciprocally informed by participatory forms of social protest and performance, like marches, sit-ins, riots, etc. So Anna, with her San Francisco Dancers Workshop, was directly involved in these developments, and their experiments soon infiltrated her husband's work. From these new art forms, the open score became the major tool for stimulating action and involving the public. Lawrence Halprin applied those theories to his work by 1, designing city spaces as scores intended to stimulate open-ended kinesthetic response, and 2, adopting the sort of temporal situational guidelines of experimental performance events like happenings to structure public participation workshops, which he called the take-part process. So the book is actually structured in those two applications of scores as built work and workshops. The section of the book on workshops focuses on the take-part process, which Halprin generated to engage community participation in urban design. Derived from the Halprin's collaborative, what were called experiments in environment, they integrated body environment awareness techniques in this workshop process, which was created in reaction to public alienation from environmental decision-making. Scores for the take-part workshop activities offer these sort of spatio-temporal guidelines for a series of cumulative experiences that were deliberately organized in a sequential and progressive manner to build up a mutual foundation for the diversity of participants. This is clearly some of the visual material you're seeing from those workshops. Those workshops often began with an awareness score, typically a city walk, to get participants immediately interacting with their environment. And because workshop participants were chosen as a community cross-section, many did not share a common background. So the activities were scored during these 2 to 3 day workshops to foster a shared experience from which a group could develop a common language and move collectively towards consensus, which consensus being Halprin's ultimate goal. And clearly you can sort of tell that this is sort of a manifestation of the times. So in my essay published in the Journal of Architectural Education, I argue most strongly for the transformative potential of many of the taking part techniques, in contrast to more conventional public process approaches. While in another essay in Landscape Journal, which you're seeing on the right, Landscape Journal is the landscape equivalent to JAE, I recognize in that article the fine line Halprin treads between facilitation and manipulation when deploying the process. So these articles, especially the latter, have been cited by a number of scholars across fields that address aspects of participatory democracy as related to the city. This research has provided a foundation to study participatory processes and activist practices of landscape architecture more comprehensively. My more recent article that came out last year in Landscape Journal, titled From Open Space to Public Space, Activist Landscape Architects of the 1960s, examines participatory processes of a number of American landscape architects working within the same socio-political context, and that includes Carl Lin, Paul Friedberg, and Lawrence Halprin. So though their methodologies and even their designs might be deemed, and often are deemed, dated by contemporary practitioners, I argue that their sort of unique ability to translate social consciousness into design action and physical propositions should serve as a model for professionals working in urban areas undergoing rapid change. My work on the landscape architect Carl Lin is building toward a book on his activist design methods. My recent CELA paper, CELA is the landscape equivalent of ACSA, for those of you who don't know the sort of landscape lingo. So my CELA paper and my additional Landscape Journal article that came out just this month, called Urban Barn Raising, Collective Rituals to Promote Communitas, introduces the concept of neighborhood commons developed and deployed in the 1960s in North Philadelphia by Carl Lin. With local residents, Lin and his students worked with community members to transform vacant lots into gathering places meant for, in Lin's words, quote, extended family living based not on blood relationships, but on mutual aid and intergenerational support. So Lin used such tactics of what he called neighborhood renewal to mitigate the damaging social effects of urban renewal clearance and displacements in long neglected areas of declining American cities. I did have a bottle of water. I wonder what happened to that. Oh, it's over there. I'm gonna grab it, sorry. Thank you. So the article investigates the process of developing those commons as a collective ritual that parallels, according to Lin, traditional North American practices of rural barn raising. So to Lin, this kind of ritual was less about the physical outcome than the collective act of communal effort. So in the article, the use of ritual action for community development is contextualized within cultural anthropologist Victor Turner's contemporaneous theories on the ritual process as a means of achieving communitas. Most primarily, the paper and the article proposes what implications such a method of working have on designing shared spaces in the city today. So just to reiterate, my research on Carl Lynn, Lawrence Halprin, Paul Friedberg, and some of their other contemporaries are all focused on activist methods of working and how revisiting those methods might expand and enrich contemporary practice. My written scholarship continues to address contested urban landscapes as well as activist design methods. My current book project, for which MIT has invited me to submit a manuscript after reviewing the prospectus, is tentatively titled, and again, just as Kelly said, it changes a lot, Action Landscapes, Design Practices for Civic and Embodied Performance. I will also say it will not be out in 2016. That was very optimistic. Most likely 2017. This book on theory, method, and action in landscape architecture emphasizes existing sociocultural dynamics as a catalyst for physical design. So challenging the common conception that participatory or socially oriented design practices or processes must sacrifice the spatial, material, and formal qualities of the landscape architectural project. So the book, again, relies on anthropologists like Victor Turner to set the framework for a ritual as a creative act for cultural production and an instrument of social change. The book additionally looks to anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who insisted on ethnography as an interpretive practice, what he called a thick description of social and symbolic action, therefore emphasizing the particular over the universal or cross-cultural. The book proposes new design methods that likewise interpret processes and practices of multicultural urban settlement, yet translates those readings not into texts like Geertz, but designs that enforce, propel, and transform such expressions of identity in the public realm. And the book features both work with my practice, Foreground Design Agency, founded with Rusiak Gabrelian, and critically assesses methods and projects by landscape architects that have been pivotal to the conversation on social processes and design. As Kelly mentioned, I recently co-edited and authored the introduction to the book, The Landscape Imagination, collected essays of James Corner, which came out through Princeton Architectural Press. And my peer-reviewed introduction situates those essays within the field's theoretical framework and most primarily identifies areas for further inquiry. So I used it as a sort of launching point to actually address where the gaps were in contemporary theory. And this was where those gaps I identified were particularly related to Corner's ambiguous stance on landscape's cultural agency. So I specifically question how we might undertake a more urgent, and these are using my own words, urgent conversation on publicness, on maximizing cultural assets and rituals, and on the importance of urban places that are meaningful for the diversity of people that use them. So it's the recognition of such gaps in landscape architectural discourse that stimulated my current book project. I've just additionally completed an invited chapter for the forthcoming book, Innovations in Landscape Architecture, to come out later this year. It is titled Expanded Thick Description, the Landscape Architect as Critical Ethnographer. And in this chapter, I argue that while landscape architecture has evolved into an urban profession that deals with consequential questions of climate change, ecological sustainability, and land use reclamation, it has moved further away from the socio-cultural dimension of landscape. While more than 40 years have passed since Geertz's seminal essay called Thick Description toward an interpretive theory of culture, his ethnographic methodology still poses a model for landscape architecture as the field attempts to retain its position as an alternative to 20th century, quote unquote, utopian practices of urban planning and design. Equally important, however, is the criticism that Geertz's approach has since received, specifically its political neutrality or the focus on locality at the expense of situating meaning into a broader context of political, economic, and social structures. So it's for that reason that I title the chapter Expanded Thick Description. In addition, while adapting the subtitle from Hal Foster's 1996 essay, The Artist as Ethnographer, I've inserted the word critical to refer to this expanded and politicized form of ethnography. In her book, Critical Ethnography Methods, Ethics, and Performance, performance scholar D. Sohini Madison explains, quote, "The critical ethnographer takes us beneath surface appearances, disrupts the status quo, and unsettles both neutrality and taken for granted assumptions by bringing to light underlying and obscure operations of power and control. Therefore, the critical ethnographer resists domestication and moves from what is to what could be." So the implication of transformative action rather than passive description is pivotal to this investigation of landscape architectural methodology. Therefore, the primary emphasis in this chapter and in my book is the sociocultural dimension of today's mongrel cities and what processes of globalization imply for a culturally interpretive practice of landscape architecture. The intention then is to frame the landscape architect as ethnographer who conducts rigorous firsthand research in the field. The methodology I'm referring to or proposing might be best outlined by these three phases which fueled Foreground's work: observation or field work, interpretation of the descriptive field work through representational practices, and translation. So observation, interpretation, translation. And translation of those interpretive drawings into physical proposals for an expanded and enhanced public realm. As stated, after fieldwork comes interpretation of the thickness of observations gathered, which for the landscape architect transpires initially through the act of drawing. An analytical aspect of fieldwork is not simply observing the dynamics of the city, but in our case, visually interpreting these rhythms to see new patterns and relationships emerge. So in this framework, representation is critical action, an ideational process rather than a more passive vehicle of communication and delivery. The interpretive ethnographic method encourages the use of dynamic representational techniques to record and interpret the rhythms and rituals of the city and translate those interpretations and interpretive frameworks into physical proposals. So in terms of translation to physical propositions, the methodological and theoretical values proposed in the chapter and the book support processes of insurgent citizenship, the interpretation of the narratives, histories, and practices of the marginalized, the displaced, and the diasporic. Through investigative fieldwork and interpretive analyses, these approaches to design partially aim to destabilize fixed social relations, provoking us into the awareness to think more critically about the social, cultural, political, and economic processes that impact our built world. So the hope is that this may in turn stimulate public discourse and heighten human compassion. The need for sites of discursive negotiation are more pressing today than ever as we exist in a period of heightened fear and suspicion of the other. Through adopted methods and practices of expanded thick description and critical ethnography, I argue that the landscape architect can transform the specific and circumstantial realities of what is into such meaningful proposals for what could be, to reference the Madison quote. So I started with my writings, my written scholarship. I'm moving into my design research. So as I've hinted thus far, it is through Foreground Design Agency, established with my partner Rusiak Abrelian, who a lot of you know, that I'm able to experiment with such design methods that I write about. Foreground is an activist and transdisciplinary practice that investigates embedded social rituals and ecological processes to generate design interventions that promote a healthy public realm. And as you can see in our mission statement, we adopt foreground as a verb, meaning to make prominent or bring to visibility. And that implies we work within a given condition, a ground, giving prominence to unique particularities of place through research-based design. This project that you're seeing here is focused on the contentious claims to public space and resources in the Rephaim Valley in Jerusalem, for which we deployed ethnographic visualization practices. And I'm not going to actually go through the proposals that emerged from this process, and you can have a look on our website. But my doctoral studies of urban renewal in the US has clearly revealed that one does not have to travel to the Middle East in order to encounter contested terrain. American cities are riddled with public histories of displacement, isolation, and reactionary protest, much of which has been erased from the legible landscape. Unjust geopolitics persist through housing policies, environmental burdens, limited access to fresh food, and so on and on. So one good example of a design emerging from this area of research is Foreground's proposal for the Pruitt-Igoe Now International Design Competition that recognized the 40-year anniversary of the demolition of those infamous housing towers in St. Louis, which were considered a symbol of the failures of public housing in the United States. The proposal, which some of you have seen, is Recipe Landscape Reinstating Collective Ritual, was named a prize winner and has been widely published and exhibited in numerous venues around the US and abroad. And it addresses the unique social, political, and ecological circumstances of the Pruitt-Igoe Housing Towers site, as well as more broadly considers the challenges and transformative potentials of US cities that have been impacted by 20th century economic restructuring. The competition proposal, and as we've started to readapt it, became one that interpreted issues of identity, marginalization, and memory as related to the contested site. And I want to note that as an instrument of social control, adult men were actually restricted from living in the Pruitt-Igoe public housing towers, making it a place composed entirely, or almost entirely, of Black female-headed households. So addressing issues of both racial and gender identity, the proposal reinstates and reimagines some of the positive attributes of the place prior to its devolution as a productive landscape of collective ritual and domestic life, while additionally introducing programs of education and entrepreneurship. This is a more recent project that addresses sociocultural rhythms and rituals. As one of the most ethnically diverse urban areas in the world, the proposal for the access points to the defunct railway in Queens, New York, that you're seeing here emerged from the analysis of the musical traditions represented along the cultural transect of the railway. And it looked to traditional or folk music of these largely monolithic ethnic identities that exist along that transect. And those identities are Indian, Chinese, Bukharan Jews from Central Asia, Puerto Rican, and Afro-Caribbean. So it used this study of traditional music as a starting point to generate movement patterns facilitated by forms that are open enough to avoid being essentialist and to adapt to population change and hybridization, while also catering to particular social rituals observed along the transect and recorded in these calendric notations. One of those rituals includes, for instance, the Fagua festival in this area. Intensive study of the characters and qualities unique to each of the musical genres, the meter, the transition, the tonal range, the level of improvisation, as well as the fusion of other musical traditions, was translated into physical parameters that endow each of the sites with their own rhythmic experience and prompt variant forms of movement. As rites of passage or movement from the everyday city streets to this new elevated public realm, the rhythmic infrastructures were intended to heighten the transformative character of this thickened threshold, as well as respond to the specificities of their location, producing interventions with larger urban consequence. So within this initial category on sort of civic action, I went from writings to design research, and now I'm moving into teaching as scholarship. Here at USC, I teach the required history and theory courses to all the students in the MLA. But I really have some opportunity for this kind of teaching as scholarship through studio, which I'll be addressing in a moment. Before that, I just want to continue talking about my research using unearthed social histories and rituals as catalysts for design intervention. I coordinated in 2012, so before I arrived here, a third-year graduate landscape architecture studio at the University of Toronto called Grounding Diaspora, Negotiating Between Home and Host. And why I'm talking about it is it's because the research that came out of it has been transformed into an article to be published by JAE in March. And I present it briefly here to sort of demonstrate the beginnings of more expansive research into territorial or landscape connotations of mass ethnic migrations affecting the world today. So the studio and the article features our design methodology, and the intention was challenging the students to consider the concept of diaspora, in particular the global dynamics of displacement and migration, and the local processes and patterns of settlement to generate a public space infrastructure that accommodates the hybridities of our contemporary cultural tradition. I co-taught it with Rusiak, and We proposed that through the concept of diaspora, that though the concept of diaspora is a global phenomenon, the local impact, one, creates fascinating and challenging socio-spatial dynamics that force us to work through the anxieties and contestations that difference generates. Two, poses questions about who has the right to the city. And three, enriches public life through the ongoing process of negotiation required to live together. So just really briefly, as one case study through which to investigate diasporic phenomena and deploy specific representational methods, the studio focused on neighborhoods in New York borough of Queens, which again is considered one of the most diverse areas in the world. And the studio site included those areas that abut JFK Airport, which you're seeing here, and Jamaica Bay. This is the Gateway National Park around the bay. So diasporic and transnational communities, each with particular histories, memories, and connections to home and host, make up the complex social fabric of the area. And I propose that with such heterogeneity comes inevitable conflict, which enriches the complexity of public life as a grounds for negotiation and exchange. One particularly palpable example is the conflict between Gateway National Recreation Area park rangers. So again, Gateway National Park is around the bay, and the Guyanese Hindus that are largely from Little Guyana, in the heart of which exists along Liberty Avenue, which you're seeing here, which is a major commercial corridor with an overhead subway. I guess that's an oxymoron. Anyway, the conflict is between the park rangers and these citizens, these Hindu citizens, where as a substitute for the Ganges River, they move through the city and deposit offerings in Jamaica Bay while enacting the puja ritual. And while rangers actually continue to argue that this practice causes harm to the bay's fragile ecosystem. So that point of contestation became the sort of seed for the studio, though not all the students addressed it directly. So both the extremely nuanced and complex output of that studio and the details of and descriptions of Foreground's design methodology will be published again in March in the Design as Scholarship section of the next issue of the Journal of Architectural Education. In particular, the article describes Foreground's methodology, which in this case we frame as twofold. First, we deploy a cultural landscape framework where social and site histories and ecologies are generative and integral to the act of design. In other words, our design process adopts a critical, interpretive, and projective approach to history. And that's really my primary emphasis at working with Foreground. And second, because of the temporal quality of the inextricable natural and cultural dynamics we explore in our design research, inventing time-based representational techniques to serve as revelatory agents for grounded proposals becomes integral. And that latter portion is largely, and that emphasis on visualization is largely Roussiac's primary focus at Foreground. So although the studio wasn't conducted at USC, it has opened up further research questions about my approach to landscape and landscape architecture, particularly in places where globalization and local cultural conditions intersect. Those questions are posed in both the JAE article as well as a forthcoming chapter in a Routledge book edited by Vinayak Barne called Global Perspectives on Heritage Conservation. And the chapter, which I've titled Ritual Practice and Place Conflict, Negotiating a Contested Landscape Along Jamaica Bay, examines the intersections of place and practice, framing the question over conservation as less about tangible heritage and more about sustaining cultural practices that imbue particular places or landscapes with social meaning. So the chapter actually critically evaluates theories of cultural landscape preservation and management and the applicability of such theoretical frameworks for the circumstances of this particular site. And most fundamentally, it will propose means of interpreting sites of public conflict, as well as conserving sites that are not deemed significant necessarily for the tangibility of their cultural relics, but for the practices that continue to shape them. I wanted to briefly talk about a seminar that I coordinated while here at USC, but through the Harvard's GSD, as a way of demonstrating how my research is starting to sort of land in Los Angeles, and then I'll talk more about how it's really sort of flourished in LA since then. But I was invited to coordinate a seminar to graduate students in architecture and landscape architecture, studying, believe it or not, abroad in Los Angeles. But while not a USC course, it provided this foundation for situating my research in Los Angeles that has impacted my teaching here. So the seminar, which was titled Contested Territories, Geopolitics, Media, and Design in Southern California, explored Los Angeles as a landscape of tenuous contradictions. So cultural complexity and social isolation, exploitative settlement, and fulfillment of the American dream, ecological diversity and environmental degradation, as well as one of the most mediated cities in the world. So with the students, we investigated socio-spatial conflicts over space, resources, and place memory in Los Angeles, how visual culture has contributed to the city's spatial construction and image, and how the design of urban space in the city and region has mediated some of its contestations and conflicts. So the interpretive representational material that came out of the seminar was intended to open up questions about how design might support productive forms of encounter and exchange in the public realm. And what you're seeing here is a student who addressed the settlement practices and patterns of the Mestizo and Creole populations from Belize here in Los Angeles. Speakers for the seminar included numerous USC faculty, including Victor Jones here, as well as Mike Davis, Norman Klein, Teddy Cruz, among many other Southern California scholars. And I'd actually love to see something like this funded and facilitated at USC. So continuing my teaching as scholarship here at USC, I've conducted a research studio for the previous 2 years on the geography of the LA uprisings as contested sites for public space design intervention. The studio, which is titled The Geography of Civil Unrest, Designing the Public Realm in the Insurgent Spaces of the City, asked that students consider the flashpoints of the 1992 Los Angeles riots or uprisings as potential sites of public space intervention. While clearly communities want to move forward from such painful moments that represent a longer history of inequity, many of the most consequential sites exist today without a palpable trace of the historic events that brought visibility to these long-standing inequities and that indelibly transformed the city. So the studio questions how design might trigger public conversation about whether and how to recognize and confront difficult pasts in the built environment. And at the same time, these memories have been erased. Many of those sites exist in the areas that continue to suffer from environmental burdens and lack of adequate public space. Therefore, the studio also questioned how landscape architecture might introduce public space that has meaning as a repository of memory while addressing the pressing needs of today. And most fundamentally, the studio and the research and the publication it has catalyzed addresses how these spaces, forgotten spaces of resistance, might persist and adapt as new forms of public space. The design research began with the discovery of 2 spreads from Joel Sternfeld's book, the photographer Joel Sternfeld's book. The book is called On This Site, Landscape in Memoriam, which pictures places of tragic or traumatic event that exist without palpable trace of those pasts. The site's image included those spreads of Florence and Normandy, which you're seeing here, as well as the location of the Rodney King beating. And they appear in the book as everyday, ordinary spaces, yet clearly have extraordinary histories. The vacuity, the images in the book, I want to mention this, are juxtaposed with this neutral written account of what occurred there. So you actually see that juxtaposition on these 2 slides. But the vacuity and the anonymity of those once potent sites of symbolic claims to socio-spatial justice in the city triggered a consideration of how design might be deployed interpretively to bring legibility to these places and to trigger discourse about the complexities of issues that prompted the riots, many of which persist. These photos by the journalist Ted Sokwi actually mark the major sites of the riots then and now, or then and 20 years later, reinforcing their anonymity today. So I just, to sort of reiterate, through this research, I'm not framing landscape architecture here as a service profession by any means. I'm not proposing simply the retail, or I'm certainly not supporting my students to propose simply the retail playgrounds, recreation centers, and food access that the community wants, needs, and expects. Instead, my interests lie in how landscape architecture might provide hybrid infrastructures that additionally interpret culture and provoke dialogue. So the primary question thus becomes, as cultural landscapes, how do we consider the utilitarian mandate of addressing dire needs while asking the public to think critically about their past and future, rather than perpetuate cultural amnesia or appeal to the common insistence on forgetful healing. So because populations have shifted and diversified, particularly in South Central, the hope is we might reinstate these urban places into discursive arenas for public debate, the negotiation of identities, and new forms of collectivity outside the institutional powers of the state, the market, and the media. And that aligns my research with the pursuit of Richard Sennett and his long insistence on living together, not simply in tolerant indifference, but in active and meaningful intercultural engagement. By focusing on two intersections for the studio, the research question asked that the students address both the memory of rebellion against tyrannical forms of power and the everyday practices and appropriations of space on these sites today as a smaller form of insurgency. So both strategies are particularly relevant now as we continue to witness the increasing rise of organized civil society and civic mobilizations where inhabitants of the city assert new forms of citizenship intended to destabilize the old. The students were asked to begin the semester by considering the initial flashpoints of the riots, which today bears no reflection of its potent past. Instead, it exists as a sort of typological example of the ubiquitous Los Angeles intersection, particularly in marginalized neighborhoods, that being an intersection distinguished by liquor stores, auto repair, and gas stations. The still standing Tom's Liquor has become the symbolic reminder of the events that occurred in 1992. The uprisings revealed the potential power of the underclass to occupy, appropriate, and claim spaces of the city. And while the beating of the white truck driver at Florence and Normandy, for those of you that remember, as we witnessed in edited form from above, was an act of seeming senseless brutality, the intersection and the act came to represent much more. The complete absence of police on the scene and their overall lack of ability to confine the quote-unquote riots to their episodic flare-ups came to be symbolic of a shift in the power structures of the city. So the flashpoints came to represent a demand for justice and a population asserting its voice. The initial studio exercise asked students to design a memory infrastructure, meaning a physical proposal that integrates a hybrid program, one that synthesizes the needs of the everyday, enforcing and enhancing the social character of the neighborhood. Second, reflects the memory of the insurgent events that occurred and made this intersection recognizable in public imagination. And three, possibly reinstates it as a public and discursive space. So this student from two or 3 years ago, Jonathan Freunds, took cues from the appropriation of the street as a public arena during the uprising and reconfigured Florence and Normandy as once again the domain of the people. I'm going through these really quickly, but he likewise proposed a larger urban strategy of deepening the street frontage of the dozens of storefront churches in the area, which he recognized were activators of public life. You see some of that through these renderings. And finally, here you see the folding of a new pedestrian-occupied memorial infrastructure with the everyday elements of the city. This is actually from last year, Chris Sisson, in an exercise that was much more compressed than the previous year, so they had a lot less time. But here at Florence and Normandy, as a symbol of communicative expression, Chris took cues from the ecology, sort of bizarre ecology of the disguised cell tower on the site, which you're seeing here. It's the only tree in a large urban radius down there. And he transformed the area around Tom's Liquor, which is at its base, into a center for communication and activism. including community rallies and gatherings, which a number of his renderings were intended to show. So Tom's itself in this proposal becomes a fresh food market, which is non-existent currently in this area. And like the previous proposal, this project has an aerial legibility and elevated access as a response to decades of aerial surveillance and the detached gaze of news helicopters capturing a version of the events taking place at the intersection. The buildings around the intersection of Vermont and Manchester were decimated by fire in the riots. This is actually an image from 1992, and then another just from very recently, probably 2014. So ironically, some who lived in this area considered this clearance through fire an opportunity to replace what had devolved into a landscape of swap meets, auto repair shops, vacant lots, from its history in the 1940s and 50s as a, quote, a community of striving and prosperous Black families, a community of Black-owned businesses and world-class entertainment. This is actually an image from the 1940s of that intersection. Yet, despite numerous plans to redevelop the area, those two massive lots that you saw here, which were scorched in the insurrection, remained vacant until last year. And that further increased the sense of blight, abandonment, and neglect. So, on a more hopeful side, modest acts of insurgent citizenship reappropriated these symbolic places, particularly through forms of informal entrepreneurship that lined the chain link fence, and that's what you're seeing here, the sort of landscape of vendors appropriating that element. As of this symbolic April 29th of 2015, so 23 years to the day of the not guilty verdict, ground was broken to transform those vacancies into what's called Vermont Entertainment Village. And it's largely an outdoor mall and seemingly very out of touch with the local consumers. I actually highly suggest you go to the website for the developers and watch the video. It's pretty retro. It looks like it's straight out of the 80s. Anyway, so in the studio, as a counterpoint, rather than simply appease community groups eager for increased consumer opportunities, the students were asked to consider both large-scale resistance and small-scale insurgencies to develop a meaningful form of public space that encourages sustained forms of encounter and exchange for the shifting and mixed populations of that area. So again, a real sort of counterpoint to what is ultimately being planned. So this student, Nan Cheng, from 2 years ago, through very rigorous visual field work, discovered that there were significant, what she calls ethnic edges, or places of transcultural conflict along the Vermont corridor. And what you're seeing here is more or less a timeline in this axis and a geography in this axis, and how population changed through time and what those sort of major edges were. These are actually notations of where there was sort of major sort of ethnic conflict through history. And then she identifies the various what she calls ethnic edges along that corridor, one of which, well, the significant one of which is at Vermont and Manchester, which she refers to as both ethnic edges and margins. So here you actually see her field work. This is actually a really good representation of that initial part of that sort of three-point methodology, the field work of how, notating how that those vacancies shifted throughout the day. And her proposal was thus about activating the marginal or overlooked aspects of South Central. And her focus ultimately on Vermont and Manchester was one of multiple programs that came together in thickened edges or margins, creating hybrid spaces for new forms of social interaction. And Nan's not here, but I will say that her research was much more robust than the final proposal, but that's a common route for a lot of students. So I'll be presenting this sort of in-progress design research at the National CELA conference in March, which I intend to transform into a paper for peer-reviewed publication. And I also intend to continue this research through design investigations with Foreground. And clearly, more recent circumstances in Ferguson and Baltimore have been a point of reference and reflection. few of these students are going to be featured today, the students that are in the audience. Finally, I will say, to culminate this section on civic action, I'm going to be talking a very compressed version of embodied action in a minute, but finally building from my research on participatory techniques. In spring 2015, I coordinated a grant-funded initiative at USC with 5 top design students focused on the reconception of the Hoover Union Triangle just north of campus. So this posed an opportunity for these students to undergo a real community design process and ultimately see the design implemented in the local neighborhood. The hope is that the actual design will be implemented by 2017. District number 1 Councilman Gilbert Cedillo secured a $500,000 grant from the Neighborhood Improvement Fund for the design and construction of the space. And I had the students, I'll go back actually to the intro slide. To start, I had the students study many participatory methodologies, including my work on Lawrence Halprin and the take-part process, and participate in a workshop by community activist and planner James Rojas, who took the students on the site to practice rapid participatory methods that he had been refining over the past couple decades. Just to flip through, this is actually a abridged version of their final proposal, but working within the timing and organizational framework set up by the city, the students developed a community process fueled by 3 workshops with community members. The final design generated was handed to the city for, well, again, hopeful construction by 2017. Very briefly, the 3 workshops began with an ideation session with community members, first doing a sort of warm-up activity modeling childhood memories using common or everyday materials, and that was directly adopted from James Rojas's practice. And the students quickly realized that modeling childhood memories and provides a sort of useful exercise for people to engage in a shared activity, and that places are integral to memory. They organized an interactive post-it activity, and during the same workshop also organized a competitive quarter-scale triangle challenge, is what they called it, using sort of everyday materials and active physicality. Teams of community members generated 4 schemes based on their sort of ideals. And you know, they then synthesized those 4 schemes into very simple concepts. Here you're seeing the canopy scheme, the urban garden scheme, the topography scheme, the monument scheme. In the second meeting, they took that synthesis of those 4 concepts, which they had actually developed, and presented them back to the community, which you're seeing here in these 4 schematics, and had the community break into smaller groups, and through both drawing and notation, interpret various aspects of the designs and what they liked and didn't like. This was then followed by a meeting with the Bureau of Street Services, who actually manages the site. This was a sort of reality check for the students as well as myself, where there was a real sort of sense of practicalities and limitations, but it actually was a real sort of worthwhile experience for the students. And this is actually just before the final meeting. The students self-initiated what was called a pop-up park, and you know, they did it because they wanted to reach a wider cross-section of the community that weren't necessarily those that were just motivated to go to community meetings, but might also be those that use the bus stops on that were actually are located on the site, and they might not live in the local community, so might not know of the meetings. And so this was actually a pretty successful day, and they actually generated a lot of feedback and were able to synthesize that feedback and integrate it into a composite scheme, which they brought to the final meeting or workshop, and had, again, feedback sessions, working feedback sessions from the community members present. You know, and I will say that these 4 out of the 5 students were in their first year of a 3-year program, so no previous experience in design. So this was actually, I think, both a really good opportunity and a really impressive output from these students, where they generated not just a sort of schematic proposals. Here you're actually seeing a performance space because the site is actually adjacent to the 24th Street Theater, cafe seating. There's actually an adjacency to a number of restaurants on Union. I think that man is wildly out of scale, but so first I'm actually noticing it. But they also addressed drought-tolerant planting, 100% water retention on site through capture and infiltration, So a lot of the technicalities and requirements of public projects, and got into the early stages of design development, picking materials and so on, lighting, and ultimately handing this off to the city again for hopeful construction. And I hope to continue pursuing opportunities like this to put my writings on participatory and community design into action in the local environment. I'm going to be moving on to embodied action, the second portion of my research, which will be much more compressed. But in addition to informing my design research on public space and patterns of settlement, my early research for my book, City Choreographer, informed the second of my research investigations on corporeality and urban design and landscape, and how the study of human movement might be harnessed as a projective design tool. So in other words, it addresses the intersections of landscape, dance, choreography, and performance studies. And that research is by no means isolated from my research on civic action. They're actually highly intertwined, and I talk about this in my book. But I address the body as, in numerous instances, as contorted by sociocultural forces and ritual practice in the civic realm. But the projects I'm going to be showing just quickly are largely about the active human body in space, largely influenced by my research of Anna Halprin's impact on landscape architecture. So in terms of written scholarship, again, I'm going to go through the three prongs. As a significant sort of starting point, I wanted to briefly present the movement-based notational techniques the Halprins developed to visualize Lawrence Halprin's environmental scores, again, emerging from his artistic symbiosis with Anna Halprin. And I feature this work in my book, City Choreographer, and the book chapter I'll be addressing in a minute. This is another example of some of Halprin's adaptations and influences of Anna Halprin on his graphic scoring techniques. So this is actually a graphic score for one of Anna's performances. This is the score for a fountain in Seattle, and this is what he's calling motation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So with Lawrence Halprin's acceptance of chance and change inherent to our modern urban condition, and related to his ecological focus, which preempted a move away from the equilibrium paradigm. He understood the city as more than a spatial problem to be fixed in master plans, but a spatio-temporal field of processes and interactions that could be structured to stimulate heightened human interaction and creativity. So in order to do so, the techniques had to be developed to visualize those dynamic forces. Halprin's graphic scores were thus drawings intended to embody, process, and instigate change. In 1965, he proposed that notational system that he called motation, from movement notation, as a supplement to conventional architectural drawings, such as the plan and the elevation, which he considered too static. Rather than simply provide a descriptive recording device, which the sort of function of the most ubiquitous dance notation, Labano notation, Halprin developed motation as a means through which a designer might use movement as a starting point to generate form. So that has stimulated my continued interest in generative design processes as related to both ethnographic and choreographic practice. That research on the impacts of Halprin's representational techniques was published in my chapter for the book Design in the Terrain of Water. And I'm actually currently working with a GRS student, Danielle Kaufman, on idiosyncratic practices of dance notation and their potentials for informing spatial design. So that's ongoing work. Moving from writings to teaching as scholarship, in terms of early research emerging from my studies on Anna Halprin and her impact on landscape architecture, my Harvard GSD seminar titled The Embodied Environment, Performance and Movement Experience explored how body movement has influenced the perception, reception, and design of the built environment over the past century. And with that foundation, we examined how designers, attuning themselves to the kinesthetic potentials of the bodies, might use movement as a generative device. And I taught in a subsequent interdisciplinary seminar at the University of Virginia called Body, City, Movement, Performance, Appropriation, which also included lectures and workshops from choreographers, set designers, and dancers. For their final exercise, I asked the students to identify and trace a spatial practice that involved direct bodily engagement with the city and develop a notational language of that activity. And then from those notational studies, they used those to generate designs for public space in the city. I'm using this as a sort of filler slide, but USC only recently started building a dance program and school, which you all can see going up pretty quickly. But I've been meeting with various new dance faculty to try and coordinate efforts and interests. And why I put this slide up is because that faculty now very impressively includes the choreographer, the very famous choreographer William Forsythe, who is particularly invested today in exploring computational notations in dance. So I think there's some great potentials for collaboration there once they really get going. And again, I've been in touch with the dean talking about those potentials. Continuing with teaching a scholarship here at USC within this section on embodied action, I taught and hope to continue to teach the first semester MLA design studio to the +3 students, so students with no previous background in design. And while we start this studio with an emphasis on the human scale, one of the sort of primary exercises was to prototype a body prosthetic or enhancement that could be used to measure and survey the site territory. The point of the exercise was to use the body as a primary means of gathering site information, and it was intended to get the students working, reading site in fully bodily presence rather than rely on distance abstractions such as conventional maps. And the assignment built on the traditions of land surveying by reading a territory through active, in this case, embodied field work, and on architectural reliance on the human body as a source of ideal proportion. And while body proportion and structure have served as the sort of authoritative foundation for Western architectural thought since antiquity, landscape introduces an expansive scale, clearly. So the body is less a point of reference for form-generating proportion, but for registering space through relational and structured movement. And I've discussed the possibility of running a vertical workshop with Kelly. The vertical workshop is a new 2 to 3 day intensive workshop integrated into the curriculum by Kelly. Discussing the possibility of a vertical workshop where MLA students would collaborate with dance students to create a design for a cited performance. And hopefully that will occur at some point soon. In addition, I'll be participating on the panel and workshop organized by Performance Study International's Performance and Design Working Group in Tasmania and Melbourne, Australia, this July, where I'm actually going to be presenting some of my in-progress research, particularly coming out of my work with Foreground. And so moving from teaching a scholarship into design research to end, it is through Foreground that we have been able to revisit the body as an active agent of design. So to foreground means to bring forward or bring close, reflecting our commitment to the body scale and offering opportunities for enriched participation in the environment. And landscape and nature have long been associated with the, quote, docile body as a sort of soft, passive, and neutral ground, awaiting the figure to endow it with purpose and order. And we reject that characterization in our practice. Just as landscape is an active agent of cultural and creativity, the body most essentially becomes an instrument of environmental participation and performance. In a really sort of playful project for a garden festival, we proposed a fully immersive garden, one that engulfs or cloaks the visitor, providing a sort of seamless vegetative blanket that both insulates and unifies. We argued that by allowing ourselves to be fully enveloped in the garden, we release control and become part of our habitational field rather than separate from it. Responding to the performance art lineage, clothing oneself in the garden becomes or provides one aspect of the engagement process, as does the collective act of wearing a common cloak, creating a new topography based on shared experience. So the far-reaching history of body, environment, artistic practice includes Oskar Schlemmer, whose work you're seeing here, who led the stage workshop at the Bauhaus in the 1920s. And with a primary focus on the body as a space-making entity, he designed costumes that you're seeing here again that geometricized the human form and its range and type of movement. So while inside its costume, the body in this garden remains rather still, its stillness registers dynamic natural process, and witnesses the social theater of visitors that are intended to enter and exit the collective cloak. And those spreads that I was showing you are from the peer-reviewed journal, II Journal, where Rusiak and I situate the project in both the history of the garden and in performance studies. Because of my research on the Halprins, we were commissioned by an artist couple who run a performative art center on the East Coast to design an outdoor performance space for dance events. And using a study of both the body in motion as well as a close analysis of the unique topographic condition, both immediately surrounding the performance studio and the larger landscape of terraced plateaus on the side of a mountain, we developed this sort of topographic scheme that works with those existing contours and character of the larger site and challenges the body to move in new ways. And this project actually moved into DD, but is currently stalled as the organization undergoes a capital campaign. The actual artist couple also just recently got a divorce, so we will see where this project leads. The intention is that it was to be built by now. Finally, I'm just going to end with this slide. In terms of Foreground's response to embodied action, I showed you a couple projects. Where we are right now is we're actually doing some recent explorations and studies into theories of the post-human and the disembodiments of technology, exploring in particular the sort of blurred distinctions between nature and culture, human and machine, and celebrating sort of hybrid ecologies and synthetic forms of nature that are representative of our technologically mediated experience. And in particular, it comments on the complete end to romantic notions of nature and recognizes that even our bodies have become part of this deliberately engineered existence. In sum, as I move forward, so that's to culminate embodied action. In terms of moving forward, I'm beginning to develop a research agenda that has a more international scope. So building from my research on diaspora, I tend to begin looking more currently at mass migrations of political refugees that are reshaping our globe and what this means at the territorial and quite local scales, particularly how spatial frameworks for specific cultural practices are translated onto alien soils. And I'm also co-chairing the upcoming conference with Kelly on landscape architecture as necessity, which has an emphasis on climate change. Within that emphasis, my own passions are related to the relationship of climate change and place attachment, as well as impacts on disappearing livelihoods and ways of life. So in other words, my focus is the cultural landscape impacts of climate change rather than the immediate, quote unquote, territorial solutions to problems. I've sort of only just begun to unpack that research, but I'm actually going to be using Armenia as an initial case study as it faces the effects of drought and desertification compounded by volatile political circumstances with its neighbors. And civic and embodied action will be integral to that study. Thank you.